Now turn to part 3. You will hear 5 short extracts in which people are talking about their work as teachers. For questions 19 to 23, choose from the list A to H which statement applies to each person. Use the letters only once. There are 3 extra letters which you do not need to use. You now have 30 seconds to look at part 3. Speaker 1.
I've been teaching maths for 35 years, and naturally I've seen a lot of changes in that time. I've attended a number of in-service training courses to make sure I'm up to date with new methods of teaching maths. It's useful to hear about different ways to teach successfully. I think that's important. And, of course, it's the computer age now. So that's taken quite a lot of getting used to. I have to admit, some of my students seem to know a lot more about computers than I do.
Speaker 2.
I went to Cambridge University and trained to be a teacher to get the best possible background for a successful teaching career. I regularly take magazines like Modern English Teacher and English Teaching Today, and I even write articles for them. I like to give new teachers some ideas to help them. I'd like to think my own colleagues at school look to me for guidance on matters of methodology. I like to pass on my experience to my department. Of course, I don't want to dictate to my colleagues, but I always appreciated the help I was given as a new teacher.
Speaker 3.
I teach history, and I think most of my students find it an interesting subject. I hope we give the students an overall view of the subject. The department believes in choosing a topic, for instance, the Romans, and looking at it not just from a purely historical point of view, names and dates, but the geographical and sociological angle as well. The students do a lot of project-based work, and by doing this, they get more involved in the topics. We also have a lot of trips to museums and other places of interest, and this motivates students enormously. It helps for them not only to read books, but to see where historic events took place.
Speaker 4.
Yes, the music department isn't bad. We encourage all the pupils to play an instrument and sing in one of the choirs. It's very pleasing that most of them do. We had to create a third orchestra to cope with the demand. The boys and girls like to take exams too. That's a change from when I came. We have a pass rate of well over 90%, by far the best in the area. Oh, they're so gifted, some of these children. We always get 5 or 6 as music scholarships to university or music college, and one of our violinists won the British Young Musician of the Year a couple of years ago.
Speaker 5.
It's so difficult with science teaching to know if you're doing it right. The pupils here are so clever and they really deserve every chance I can give them. I try to take the syllabus and find new ways of explaining the subjects, and I design experiments to illustrate them. I don't know if they really work though. I get very nervous in front of the class and I think it shows. I'm sure the other teachers are better. Still, the exam results were quite good last year, and the pupils gave me a present at the end of the last class before the summer holidays. It was really very nice of them.
Now turn to part 4. You will hear an interview with a woman, Imogen Khan, who campaigns for fair trade between EU countries and the developing world. For questions 24 to 30, choose the best answer, A, B, or C. You now have 1 minute to look at part 4.
Today I'm happy to say we are lucky to have Imogen Can here in the studio to talk to us about ethical shopping and fair trade. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule, Imogen. I'd like to begin with asking you what you mean by fair trade.
Let's look at the way we get a lot of our goods from abroad first. Many companies operate globally and have their factories in countries in the developing world, or buy products from farmers in the developing world. Often these companies use very cheap labour or pay very low prices so that we in Europe can have cheap products. The problem is that because the tea and coffee is so cheap, the people who grow them can never climb out of poverty. If we pay just a few pence more for our goods, that money can be used to give a fair price to traders in the developing world.
Are you saying that we should pay more for the things that we buy?
Yes, but it's not as simple as that. You need to look at the products you are buying and check that they have the fair trade symbol. This means that the higher price you pay for the goods is actually passed on to the producer. If you just buy a more expensive product, but it isn't a fair trade company, then the extra profit goes to the company and not to farmers or workers in the developing world.
You mentioned products like tea and coffee. Is there anything else we should be careful about buying?
We should be careful about everything we buy. But another thing I wanted to talk about was clothing. Here in the EU, we know the conditions that farm animals are kept in, but we know nothing about the conditions in clothing factories in the developing world. Many of the workers work in appalling conditions. Some people are working for between 12 and 16 hours a day for less than $1 a day, just so we can buy very cheap clothing.
So is it only cheap clothing companies that use these kinds of factories?
That's a good question, actually, and the answer is no. Even expensive designer labels use these kind of factories. Basically, the problem is that when we buy clothes, we have no idea what kind of conditions they were made under. What we need is for clothing companies to come under the fair trade umbrella and label the clothes so we know where they were made and that the workers had decent conditions and a proper living wage.
So why hasn't this happened already?
Many companies are dragging their feet because they are afraid of losing sales if their prices are a bit higher, in order to make sure the workers who make their clothes get a fair wage. The companies claim that all the factories have been inspected, but the truth is that they don't make much of an effort to ensure that factories have decent working conditions. So they need to be put under pressure until they do something about the problem.
How can this be achieved?
Hit them in their pocket. The only way to get companies to change is if you stop buying their products until they change the way they do business. When a company knows that being ethical and fair trade is to its benefit as a company, then it will do it. In the meantime, there are lots of really good ethical fair trade clothing companies that you can buy from. They might be a bit more expensive, but maybe it's worth thinking about buying less anyway. We've become too much of a throwaway society in recent years. I tend to buy a lot of my clothes second-hand as well, because you can find wonderful things very cheaply and support a charitable cause when you buy them.
My final question is about gadgets. We've talked about food and clothing, but what about gadgets? Is there any campaign to make them more ethical?
This has to be the next important area for raising awareness about the ethical behaviour of large corporations. Unfortunately, it won't be easy. First of all, because the tech companies who make the most popular gadgets are very large and very powerful. Many developing countries are begging them to come and open factories in their areas, and they will agree to almost any terms. And the other problem is that many of the modern gadgets like tablets and smartphones are desirable items, and people don't want to boycott the companies and stop buying their goods. It's a shame.
Well, thanks, Imogen. It looks like we've a long way to go before we all become ethical consumers. I wish you lots of success with your campaigns.
Thanks.